Good morning, everyone. A quick lecture on the introduction of Nimanthi Rajasingham's book, Assembling Ethnicities in Neoliberal Times, Ethnographic Fictions and Sri Lanka's War. It's going to be very brief because the book is in English, and the hope is that you get the original book and read it. It was just published in Sri Lanka as well by Taproban Publishers, while the edition, the USA edition, was out in 2018. But I'll keep it, I'll also have a short program in English because it might give a good idea of what this book is about, and I believe it has some concepts which are useful for us to know. Simply to know that these ideas also exist, these discussions also happen, and knowing that might help us understand our position better in this country, in Sri Lanka. So, in the introduction, assembling ethnicities is such an interesting thing for us to recall now, because ethnicity is a concept that we hardly question anymore. We went to war on it. We are already going through tension with another community because of ethnicity, religion, and everything connected. How did it happen? How did ethnicities come into being? Of course, it's not a simple this because of that situation. She does a very interesting thing. She considers how the economic system is linked to, can be linked to the birth of ethnicity as well. And she looks particularly at a particular system of economic capitalism. And then, it's neoliberal formation which we undergo at present. So, in her interview, which I do in English and Sinhala, which will run after this, she says she's exploring the link between the capitalistic ideas, neoliberalism, and ethnicity as well, looking specifically at Sri Lanka. Right? She takes a very clear leftist stand where she's critiquing neoliberalism, and she does it through what she calls ethnographic fictions. A very interesting term. Ethnography is connected to anthropology, sociology, or description of people, a community. Fictions. Normally, fiction is left for describing what we call creative writing. The fiction of writers, and she does use it in that sense also. She starts the book by talking about Sivanandan's When Memory Dies, which is a clear depiction of Sri Lankan history from a leftist angle, a beautifully written novel, and it was translated into Sinhala recently, Mattaka Miyadana Sanda by Hasita Abhiyawardena. So those fictions are also there, and she later goes to Shobha Shakti's, Gorilla, and actual fictions like that. But she expands the term to mean even what is called anthropological or ethnographic writing. Now, if you go back to colonial times, and you can't possibly discuss the present without referring back to those times, because much of those thoughts and ideas have still come down and are still with us, not just in Sri Lanka, globally. She says, the travel writing, the sailors writing, and the people who thought they were being scientific and objective simply because they described what they saw. And Nimanthi leads it back to Francis Bacon and people like that during that time in Europe, who thought that describing what you see makes it very scientific, without ever realizing that simple description might also be an act of creation. They might be creating something by a simple description, because they put categories in place. Descriptions are deadly sometimes because they put categories in place as if they've always existed, as if that's how things are. And she gives a beautiful example from Leonard Woolf in his Village in the Jungle. So in the introduction, she deals with, starts with Sivanandan, and then she goes to Robert Knox, his writing, and then Leonard Woolf's Village in the Jungle, to show how this category of ethnicity or race has been created. and the taking of Knox and Woolf, Knox in the 17th century and Woolf in the 20th century, there's a gap between the writing of those two works, which are based in this country. But in one, race is very amorphous. Knox can't quite get his hands on what race means. Like sometimes he says it's color. Very importantly, it may be about not being in his own religion. And by the time Woolf was writing, he's very definite and very clearly denotes race in a way that Nimanthi says it looks almost as if Woolf, being a colonial administrator, wanted to emphasize difference in people and codify difference, put it categorically into two separate entities, because that was the British policy anyway, divide and rule. So that's what she does in the introduction, but she starts with a very global outlook, capitalism and race. She talks about how the concept of race has been linked to maybe profit making, maybe economy. And here, of course, I must say that, the words are very nuanced when we speak about something like race, because race is now generally for the black and white divide, and for, like, say, Sinhala, Muslim, Tamil, we use things like ethnic grouping or ethnicities. So one thing I did when I was talking to her in Sinhala and in my lecture in Sinhala was say that when you speak about these things in Sinhala, it's difficult to sometimes show the nuances, because one word may be used for many different subtle meanings, and we do tend to get stuck very often. And in Capitalism and Race, she does point out in her interview, this is one way of thinking, and there are others who have disagreed that race existed long before capitalism or anything else. So, not to simplify, but when you do brief lectures of describing something, it does tend to get simplistic. So I'm just putting that warning out there. And an example she gives from a subsection called racial capitalism, where she has analyzed a few theorists, is how race was used to justify not treating all people the same way. Now, in any kind of enterprise, and if you take the US example, like she has shown, there were plantations. Plantations were acres long. You needed labor, you needed manual labor. And the conditions of those manual laborers weren't very good. And you know that the Africans, the slaves were taken to the USA to be put as workers for no payment, right? And before that in Europe, another theorist has said it was Irish people who were, made to do some menial work. And in cases like that, they needed to justify. For example, the USA believed in freedom. That was their rallying call when they broke away from the British. Free. Everyone has a right to be free. So once you say that, then how do you justify the fact that some people are not free and working in the plantations in utter extreme unfreedom? Then they brought race in. So again, not that simple, but race allowed people to be exploited without the people exploiting them feeling bad. They would say they are a different category of people. They don't understand the concept of freedom. They would not know how to use it. So very often, even now, even for ethnic groupings, we see those terms being used. This doesn't mean the same to those people. I mean, though I'm talking about slavery and all that, it's you. If you're observant enough, you see this happening all the time. These kind of people don't understand this concept. Okay, so in profit making endeavors, if there was a category of people who were consistently used and exploited, they may have used race or these people are different kind of thinking to justify what they did. And that was there are many more details. Please do get the book and read it. Racial Capitalism, she deals with that. And then she also has a section where she talks about what, before that, I like just a few quotes. I mean, I hope you get the book. She says, neoliberalism can be defined as both an economic restructuring of markets and a governing rationality and technology for population control. So, I mean, neoliberalism is a modern term of how the world is going now. These things are still happening, and it's still not just about the economy, it's also about population control, getting people to act in particular ways. Right. Let me, I won't go into detail because then I wouldn't know where to stop. I hope you get the chance, if you can handle the English here, that you get a chance to read it. Then she spent some time talking about ethnographic fictions, what I said, how description can be quite deceptive in showing their creative potential, that you might say something which you take as a given fact, but which might in fact not have been so. And let me just quickly to couple, she talks about a theorist, Eleni Konduriotis, in her excellent exploration of African ethnographic novels, argues that cataloging, quantifying, fixing, and alachronic discourses are central to the emergence of this form, which she calls, I think I have to go before that to give you the correct definition. If ethnography generally refers to anthropologists carrying out observations in order to produce knowledge that accurately represents the reality of another culture, Assembling Ethnicities broadly defines ethnographic fictions as creative writings, performances, theatre, art, and films that take seriously the tasks of representation and mimesis in all their troubling and useful ways. The ways in which description can be used can be troubling. To couple the term ethnography with fiction is to argue that truth claims are produced through the use of imagination and within specific historical context, and to take seriously the documentation folded into fictional text. Very often Francis Bacon and everyone considered imagination to be out of what they described, which is what they saw with their eyes. But as later theories and later, literary theory, structuralism, destructuralism, and all that came, modernism, we know that no language is actually without belief, without a belief system beneath it, without ideology coming into it in some sense. At some point, your own location, your own beliefs do come into what you call objective text. And she goes into two texts, as I said, Robert Knox's historical relation, and Leonard Woolf's Baddigama. The full meaning of Robert Knox's full title of the book he wrote in 1681, he wrote it on the way out of Ceylon, because he was a boy when he was captured by the Sinhala king. He was here, I think, 15 to 19 years, and he escaped. He wrote things on the way back, which were then edited and published, and it became quite a classic where people took it as, this is how you describe people you're with. And the whole title is An Historical Relation of the Island of Ceylon in the East Indies, right, where he describes the 19 years he has in Ceylon. And Nimanthi describes the way you can unpack some of the sentences that he has used to show that during his time, race wasn't a very clear category, right? And she says maybe the fact that they were not Christians and he coupled the term heathen enemies. Enemies, but heathen means not of the same religion. That could have been a factor. The geographical location could have been a factor. Uh, who was governing them could have been a factor for difference. But race really doesn't come as a feature there. But by the 20th century, where Leonard Woolf was in Sri Lanka in 1904 to 1911, and then he wrote this, and he was quite disgusted with what the colonials were doing, though he was a British and he left the system. And he wrote the novel, The Village in the Jungle, to show the unfairness that can happen to white men who don't really understand the workings of a village in a place they are colonizing. And what Nimanthi says is that this man, simply by putting in footnotes or describing how different people were, codifies or stabilizes categories that may not have been so stable really, right? And she says he does it specifically for the Sinhala and the Tamil, and that he is very clear about who should eventually own or eventually be the claim ownership of Sri Lanka, which was moving towards independence. This novel was written, I think, in 1913 or something, like much before or at the very beginnings of the nationalistic movement. But she pinpoints a footnote that Leonard Woolf makes in his novel, and you know that footnotes are normally these throwaway comments which people use to give facts to people who don't know much about something. But if you use footnotes, others who know don't have to look at the footnote, right? So in 1913, he could actually say there are two distinct races in Ceylon, Tamils and Sinhalese. Their language, customs and religions are different. The Tamils are Dravidians, probably the original inhabitants of India. They are Hindus in religion. The Sinhalese are Aryans and their religion is Buddhism. The Tamils inhabit the north and the east of the island. The Sinhalese the remainder. So in 1913, so Nimanthi questions why does he codify this so strictly, right? And to say they are different, they don't, they don't mix, they are distinct races, which she says comes later in Silindu and the family's trip to Benaragama, which is technically Kataragama in reality. The Tamils are described as such strange people that he doesn't even give a chance for the Sinhalese also to feel part of it. They are just being observed, and that this may not really have been the way we might have, or the Sinhala people might have considered some customs, whether it was such a strange thing to them. And she links it to the colonial project of divide and rule. You know that when the British people went, one thing they did, if there were any differences, they codified it and made it stabilized so that people didn't have unity but thought in categories, and that these categories were completely amorphous is something that at present we might forget. For example, in 1835, the census and the importance of census, Professor Neera Wickramasinghe and others have said the census really helped Sri Lankans to differentiate themselves from each other, right? And 1835, the report only had white and blacks as the difference. 1871, there were 78 nationalities and 24 races. 1881, 10 years after, the census only had 7 races. And then nationalities were not used. And in the 1911 census, Neera Wickramasinghe elaborates on how ideas by the racial theorist Robert Knox, which is not the same person, were incorporated into the census from 1840 onward to define Sinhalese and Tamils as clearly different racial groups. E.B. Denham, the author of the 1911 census, argued it is clear to the more superficial observer that there are very marked physical differences between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. As Vikramasinghe points out, when benefits from the state and access to power became organized around categories such as race, then this had an impact on how local populations identified themselves and internalize these forms of categorizing. The importance of census in asking people, what religion are you, what do you follow, what race, was something. The census was also introduced by the West, helped internalize these categories by ourselves, so that by the time our generation comes, or generations younger than ours, we don't even question these things. And another fiction that actually shows this transition happening, I would say, is Kaushalya Kumarasinghe's Nimnagi Itihasaya. That's a book in Sinhala, not translated yet into English. If you can read Sinhala, please get a hold of that book, where these identities are much more flexible. And Nimanthi does a good job in showing how those are fixed in any global, any historical context, when the fixing works in favor of those who want it fixed, right? So the context dependency of these categories is something that we forget. Those categories are put in place for a reason at a particular time. And maybe understanding that might be important, right? So she finishes the introduction by analyzing Woolf's novel quite differently from the way it's analyzed. I think normally you can analyze Woolf's novel as as something a sympathetic white man had written to show the problems of colonialism, right? Because he was very much for the people he was describing. Or you could analyze it in a post-colonial angle and show how the white man's condescension or lack of, though there was shallow sympathy, he actually does equate Silindu to like some dumb animal of you can do it in a post-colonial angle in which you critique Woolf for what he did. And Nimanthi does it to show that how clearly Woolf seems to have been sure of racial categories, and how sure he had been of who should one day claim ownership of the nation, because he clearly says some are not even mentioned, right? Like the Muslim community doesn't feature much. There are two races, as Woolf says, and people with like mixed names like Fernando are clearly given evil characteristics. And then the family in Baddegam all fail technically. Silindu, Baboon, Punchi, Manika and Hinnihami. And Nimanthi says the reason that Woolf has shown them failing is that they did not grasp the opportunities given by the Sinhala Buddhist nation for them to have escaped their fate. For example, Baboon is given the chance to, or the father is given the chance to go into and colonize a different area, and he refuses. He wants to stay in his village. So in various ways, I won't go into particular detail because you need to read the book for that. She shows how clearly a colonial has put in place what should happen in the future. So Nimanthi's introduction, which this is the only thing I will handle today. We will go into first chapter tomorrow, where she speaks about what the Gamudav and things like that created, and what was sold within that process. That's the first chapter. But she ends it here by showing how some things are codified, stabilized, put in place through fiction, and in this case clearly a novel, and how by the time we the reason I am talking about it now is, by the time we have come to like the 21st century, there are things we don't even question. And her global, like the racial capitalism theories that she has shown us, show that the reason race and categorizing could have happened may have been a very specific reason for the profit of a very specific group. And even though I feel that even though we may not agree or, you know, subscribe to the same belief, it's important that we know such discussions happened. So at every point, we'll have more knowledge in which to analyze our own situation. So this will be followed, my lecture now, I'll finish it now, will be followed by a discussion with Professor Nimanthi Rajasingham about the introduction. And we hope to continue like discussing this book piecemeal, piece by piece, maybe chapter by chapter or 2 or 3 chapters together, whatever the way it goes, so that you get a in-depth idea of the book. Well, not in-depth, but at least a rough idea of the book, but with short video talks. Thank you very much.